Good evening to our LBE community. Good evening to the broader community that we know joins us for these sessions. We are very excited for tonight's conversation on colorism in Hollywood. This is a very hot topic right now and always has been and probably always will be. But we want to give as much space as possible for our speakers this evening. So we are going to launch right in. I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight and then turn the conversation over to them. Joining us this evening is Dr. Treya Allen, who is a program manager for diverse and inclusive advising practice at the University of Arizona and a faculty member at Pima Community College. Her research covers the intersection of Black women in education, specifically in higher education. She is the curator of underground retention programs, Auntie Networks, and most recently, the developer of an African American Studies program at Pima Community College. Also joining us this evening is Dr. Mary Roth. Dr. Roaf is currently an assistant professor of ethnic studies at Stanislaus State. She completed her PhD from Temple University in applied anthropology and is a critical scholar whose teaching and research examines social inequities in education, specifically the school to prison pipeline, in relation to race, class, and gender. Dr. Roaf's scholarly interests also include women of color feminisms and popular culture, and she has several years of professional experience as a K through 12 teacher coach and as a public policy advocate in the nonprofit sector. Welcome to both of you. I turn the stage over to you.
Thank you, Khara. Thank you, Lived Black Experience community members from all over, whether you are taking the opportunity to come and join us for this ever evolving dialogue in real time, and or whether you're able to check in via recording. We welcome you, and we both are so excited. We could do a whole individual kind of like lived Black experience series on colorism alone. So this is really intended to be a starting point. And the way that Dr. Allen and I are really thinking of this in terms of colorism, especially pertaining to Hollywood, even though it's across the board, right? It applies across the board, it's global. It applies to not only African diaspora communities as well as the continent, but pretty much everywhere, is really this insistence on white adjacent beauty representation. So even in the age of changing beauty standards and the phenomena known as blackfishing, for example, where we have white women from Europe and from all in the U.S. Taking on the aesthetics of what we like to call blackish kind of fishing or kind of exotic or mixed race, right, aesthetics. There's still inherent in it this doubling down on white adjacent beauty. Next slide, please. So here we are. Khara gave a wonderful introduction, and I just wanted to um, point your attention to our contact email addresses in case um, you would like to reach out to us with questions or just to connect beyond our time with LBE. Next slide, please. So this topic, it's the topic that never dies. It's the more things change, dot, 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 the more they don't, right? The more they stay the same. And we're focusing on Hollywood. And I think many of us may know of the whole kind of not only the racial caste system that was created globally and in the US, and also the color stratification, the color caste system, right, that was established globally and in the US, stems directly from slavery itself, and not just from the political economy, but the sexual economy of slavery, from the children who were the products of systematic mass rape, not only directed towards enslaved women, but also men and children. And of course, with enslaved women giving birth to kind of what's now known in the common language lexicon of the house slave, right? And there's versus the field hand slave. And Lena Horne, who started out during the Harlem Renaissance. Actually, started her career as a 16-year-old dancer in the Cotton Club in Harlem, and she ended up ultimately debuting as a screen actress in the 1930 film, which was a short film, in Cab Calloway's Jitterbug Party. And I actually looked her up, and what's really not uncommon actually is the search query that I entered into my browser was Lena Horne biracial? And she was not. Both of her parents were Black, and they were of mixed ancestry, and they were Black. I mean, we're talking about it not to just 11 years before she made her debut in this film was when the Virginia General Assembly passed the one drop rule, or the rule of hypodescent, which meant that if you were one of 132nd African descent in the US, you were classified as Black. So she actually was not biracial, but after generations of this kind of systemic, right, sexual violence perpetrated against enslaved Black peoples, this is what you get. And this is really reminiscent of when I gave the talk. It's been like so many months now. My body is a Confederate monument. And this really even touches on to the talk that Dr. Allen and I facilitated back in July on looking at why are there no Black princesses, and looking at representation when it came to Disney, which is a niche kind of market in Hollywood. So Lena Horne was definitely embraced by Hollywood, and she has gone on to become an icon. She was also a staunch civil rights activist, and she was obviously extremely white adjacent. I mean, we can look at her, we know this. And let's forward wind almost 80 years later, 2001, Halle Berry, who is biracial. Her mother is from the United Kingdom. Her father is Black American. And she becomes the first Black actress, I mean, this is in 2001, to win an Academy Award for Best Actress. And so, and she's she's considered one of the most beautiful women in the world, and she had all types of roles on like we talked about the Dorothy Dandridge film, on a biopic on HBO, all types of movies, and even there was controversy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the film Monsters Ball, for which she won this Oscar, and she portrayed a very impoverished, destitute Black woman in the Deep South, who and this was a Lee Daniels production, who through some kind of series of sick, demented coincidences ended up hooking up with the same prison guard who kind of was the last person with her husband and the father of her child, played by Sean Combs, or Puff Daddy, and who was electrocuted, who was sentenced to death, and it was carried out. And she ends up with the kind of the executioner, in a sense, who is a white man. So yeah, there's even controversy over her winning this Oscar for portraying what is called in common day kind of popular language a bedwench, which also harkens back to slavery and is very, very problematic, because this was involuntary, right? This was involuntary sexual slavery. And when we talk about enslaved Black women, they were often driven and worked harder than the men, produced more, right, than the enslaved men. And then they were also subjected to really unremitting sexual violence. And so when people are throwing around that term bedwench on social media, they don't know what they're talking about. And it's decontextualized, and it's misogynoir. It is hatred against Black women, hard stop, and regardless of who is hurling these labels around so recklessly. Next slide, please. So let's talk about colorism. It's all over the place. It's everywhere. We can't escape it. I mean, it's another pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic. If we think about colorism as a byproduct of racism and of white supremacy and of anti-Blackness, and it really has to do with colonization and genocide and enslavement all over the globe, and it's the Europeanization around the globe. And so it's very simple, it's very straightforward. Those who are deemed physically closest to white in every culture, like literally on every continent that's populated, are most valued and have far greater economic, political, social, and cultural privilege than those within the same groups who are physically furthest from whiteness in terms of not only their skin color, the texture of their hair, but also their features. Now we know, and every continent had a much greater range of skin shades, of body types, of hair texture, of features, with the exception of Europe. Europe has the least amount of variation, right, historically. And so this is why they became so consumed with skin color and created whiteness. And we can see with Lupita Nyong'o, who is definitely considered dark skinned, who is a Kenyan, and was born in Mexico. So the Lupita is a kind of a shortened nickname or derivative of Guadalupe. And she was born in Mexico, I believe Mexico City. She is an actress, and she is also an Academy Award winner for Best Actress in a Supporting Role in 12 Years a Slave. So again, we keep seeing Black actors and actors even being awarded Academy Awards for portraying kind of the most debased, right, dehumanizing and destitute kind of struggle roles, especially in relation to white actors and whiteness itself. And despite Lupita's obvious beauty, she's been very vocal in sharing about how representation really mattered, and she saw so few images that mirrored hers. And I would say if we get more into the complexity stemming from colorism, that is a whole configuration or matrix of isms, including texturism, including featureism. She does have the kind of facial features and kind of body stature, which is very slim, right? It's been subjugated to Europeanization, even though on the continent of Africa we have such a wide range. But in the United States, for example, blackness is almost exclusively kind of pigeonholed into looking like a very kind of small phenotype or physical type that we most often find on the West Africa, right in West Africa, and on the coast in particular, because that's where most of the kidnapped Africans came through there. So it gets complex, but yeah, I just wanted to show the difference between Lena Horne and Halle Berry versus Lupita Nyong'o. So this is considered dark skinned in the U.S. Now I know what's considered dark skinned, especially when it comes to diasporic Black peoples, it varies depending on the context. I mean, we can get into the bleaching that's really rampant. And I think that not just on the continent of Africa or in the African diaspora, but across the board, around the world, it's really important that researchers have really leaned into this issue of colorism in the U.S. and I believe abroad as well, where there are real material benefits, right, to being deemed closest to whiteness and being privileged as someone who is either biracial, right, multiracial, or who is simply considered to be a light-skinned Black person who's not as ethnically ambiguous as someone, especially women who are biracial or multiracial. Think about Meghan Markle, who's never self-defined as a Black woman, even though her mother is a Black woman, and even though her parents divorced, and she really had a very strange relationship with her white father, but because of her appearance of looking very ethnically ambiguous with a tinge of Blackness, right? That is the desired aesthetic. She's been able to move into the world without identifying as a Black woman or having that label externally imposed on her, which is beyond our choice. But then she hit that ceiling when she actually had the audacity to marry into the chief colonizers, otherwise known as the royal family. Sorry if anyone's logging in from the UK, but um, what I also want to add about this is, so when we look at like real economic benefits, when we look in terms of who is serviced, who receives greater service in healthcare, who has greater access to education benefits, to employment benefits, We talk about the marriage market as an economy. Black women in the US who are classified as light skinned are they marry at significantly higher rates than Black women in the US who are classified as dark skinned, such as Lupita. um, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline and with how Black students in particular from preschool all the way through the end of high school, if they make it that far, are disproportionately pushed out of schools through expulsions, through suspensions, through being warehoused into special education when they don't need those services. The statistics are first Black boys and then second Black girls who are characterized as dark-skinned Black girls, then Latinx boys, then Native American boys. Black girls who are characterized as light-skinned are not even in that top list of students who are targeted for the school to prison pipeline. So, because those, when you get pushed out of school at any level, you're much likelier to then be redirected into the juvenile injustice system or the adult injustice system in the US. And so this is way beyond vanity. This is way beyond, especially because it's so critical to understand this at the intersection of race and gender and color because of how this disproportionately impacts women and Black women in particular, especially in the US, where every group of women is elevated right above Black women. Dr. Allen's going to get into this kind of flip side of the coin when it comes to the objectification and sexualization of Black women versus Black men in a US context. This is way beyond, I want to feel better about myself. This is way beyond, get over it, develop some self love and self esteem. This has to do with real life opportunities and from the womb to the tomb. But because it's most often reduced to just an issue that only impacts Black women, it gets minimized, it gets dismissed. There's a lot of gaslighting, right? It's way deeper than that. And the last thing I want to say about colorism before moving on is many definitions, if not most definitions, will frame this as something that is intra-cultural, that it is individuals within the same group who are perpetrating colorist discrimination of all and persecution really and oppression towards members of the group. But the reality is colorism is weaponized by white supremacy and by the white supremacist institutions and structures and right society at large, so that it also plays out externally, right? Which makes sense because colorism was created by right by white supremacy, and so it was created externally. Now, has it been internalized and by colonization itself? Absolutely, it's been internalized, and it's structural. It will continue even when people are very intentional about, I'm doing this so that I can get ahead, so that I can attain a greater quality of living in life, and so that I won't be completely ground down into the dust if I have that option. It's not just about vanity and self-esteem. It's not just individualized. It's literally access to better jobs, even if marriage is not on the table, better outcomes across the board. And so it's very important to keep note of that, and to the fact that even though it is seen as being very internally based and driven, it's also externally imposed. Next slide, please. So, Walker, 1982. I believe this is Alice Walker. Yeah, mm, love Alice Walker. Colorism defined very simply, it's prejudicial, or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their color. That's it. Right. So it's a derivative of white supremacy. Um, so I just want to pause on this. It's very, very simple. I think about how simple this concept is. I think about a saying that I learned as a child. It's so simple that I've retained this rhyme from the time I was probably 5 or 6 years old. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. That's how simple it is. A 5-year-old child understands colorism, and even younger, and starts internalizing it, because that's how simple it is. Next slide, please. So Dr. Allen and I addressed a pretty woman, and it's a modern day Cinderella version of a Cinderella, a Disney-fied version of the Cinderella folktale, original European folktale, in our last time at LBE with Where Are All of the Black Princesses?
Absolutely.
And this is a quote that Dr. Allen, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to always remind people is that Hollywood is like the collective imagination of this mythical place called white America, right? And so why I call it a myth is that we understand that America, as it's being told, this story that we tell about America, is not necessarily the truth, right? It is, as Dr. Roaf says all the time, like this image is the figment of white supremacy. We know that even before Hollywood was there, that entertainment did not look this way at all. Whether we are, and we're not necessarily talking about film, but we're just talking about entertainment, right? So in Pretty Woman, you have this seemingly homeless black man who is like rolling around Hollywood talking about, what's your dream? Everyone has a dream. And the interesting part is it's juxtaposed to this sex worker, right? That no Hollywood star at the time, Sigourney Weaver and some of the other big names at the time that Pretty Woman came out, no one wanted a part in that movie because ironically, it like demonstrated for Hollywood, or it demonstrated for like whiteness across the board. It's like everything that does not make whiteness white, right? So these are characteristics that we would typically see in blackness, and that's how it's defined. So it's interesting to me that in this movie, we have a seemingly homeless black male rolling around the streets of LA talking to people about their dreams and what those dreams mean and how they could potentially like how even if your dream doesn't come true, everyone still comes to Hollywood because Hollywood is the place. It's Tinseltown. It's the place where dreams can be made. Now, really quickly, we're gonna Carrie, you can go ahead and like represent the slides. But I think that something that Dr. Roaf said is really, really key here, and it's like this Euro centralizing of beauty standards, like this white aesthetic, because it does not matter how a role is written. It does not matter what a role says. It doesn't matter even if the actual book. I was thinking when you were saying this, Dr. Roaf, I was thinking about the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie was supposed to be a black boy, and it was like, absolutely not. We will not greenlight this film unless Charlie and Charlie's parents and grandparents can be situated in whiteness, right? And that really goes to your point of everything must be centered in this Eurocentralized narrative of this is what America is, this is what entertainment is, right? And so if Hollywood is the collective imagination of America, then what role do darker hued people play in that? If Eurocentricity is the standard of those stories. So Khara, if you could bring back the PowerPoint presentation, because I actually want to like maybe demonstrate a little bit about for those people who are like, well, I've never experienced colorism, so is this really an issue? It absolutely is. And the perniciousness of our socialization is we may not even realize that we tend towards the lighter skinned individual. And let me go out here and say this as well, because Dr. Roaf painted this beautifully. It's not always intra, and it's not always just germane to skin tone. It could be eye color. It could be acting chops. It could be where you started, your aesthetics in terms of body type as well. We know that in this country that typically if a person presents, if a woman presents and says she needs help and she is overweight or appears to be larger than standard sizes, that then the narrative in our head is really about, well, why is this individual why are they asking for help when they're probably just lazy? So we attach meaning to these things automatically within our head, and if we don't challenge those, it becomes really easy for us to then prefer the light-skinned chick with the light eyes, right? And we see this throughout the entertainment industry, not just in Hollywood, but definitely seated there. And especially when we consider Hollywood the place of money. Now, we do see like several of these, we see several individuals like making an actual deterrent from there. So you have Tyler Perry Studios, you have Kev on Stage Studios, you have a lot of like the ground roots independent work that is really centering stories rooted in the community. And it's not just the Black community, right? We also have other communities that are doing the same as well. But when we get into this idea of the idealized other, next slide, please, versus the authentic other, right? Or the imagined other, really what we see is the idealized center needs a leading man or a leading lady. Whiteness becomes the standard. It's always going to be Eurocentric standards, beauty standards, and whiteness will always win over authenticity, and comfort is placed before truth. So what do I mean by that? At the bottom of your screen, you should be seeing 3 images of 3 actresses. So from left to right, you see Natalie Wood, Paula Abdul, and then you see Nia Long, right? So when we get into the imagined other, Paula Abdul is really the imagined Blackness that Hollywood is willing to kind of deal with, if you will, right? She is ethnically androgynous. We can't tell which community she belongs to. And this is an actual picture of Paula Abdul at some comedy event, right? And then if you place her in between, if she becomes the in-between, right, between the imagined other and the idealized center, then that means actresses like Nia Long only become community famous or Black famous. They don't ever become Hollywood famous. So the primary roles are provided to those who closely resemble the idealized center, such as Paula Abdul. Stereotypical caricatures of the marginalized other typically. So this is why you only have like the sassy girlfriend who happens to be Black, or your best Black friend's brother who is super chocolate and beautiful to look at, but he's a dumb jock, right? So authenticity is defined. So even when we're telling black stories, or just stories that don't center white folks, or any stories, authenticity is defined by Eurocentric standards. And that also may mean that white actors and white actresses are casted in those roles. So this then becomes like, okay, if you're Hollywood famous, then you are, your approximation to whiteness is closer. If you're a woman. Now, when we talk about what happens when you're a man, that's when it gets kind of interesting, right? Next slide, please. So one of the first movies, and this movie is, for whatever reason, like a classic standard when we're teaching film programs, is this movie called Birth of a Nation. And I've only just grabbed some of the steals. But when you're watching this again, I want you to pause for a minute and tell me what it is that you see in these images. Do yourself a favor and write them down. I'm going to actually narrate some of them for you. This first image with this European man who comes from European heritage is basically blackface, and he represents this savage, right? This savage that is after this white woman. In the second image, you see the white leading lady, or the damsel in distress, who behind her is backed up by an imagined Black body, which is also a European origined woman in blackface, right? And so this is really what becomes the image of Blackness in film. And this film is still taught as a classic film to show how far along we've come. But the other thing that it does is it keeps in rotation this idea of the marginalized, the authentic marginalized body, right? So if you are playing in these roles and you are dark skinned, then you are associated with savagery. You are associated with ugliness, right? And it's really this, back to this white supremacy thing. It's meant to like define what whiteness is. So you have to have an imagined other to really get to whiteness being the equivalent of purity, beauty, anything that is normal, right? And this D.W. Griffiths, like, so essentially what happens, this movie is 3 hours long, y'all. I was definitely not watching this. But what happens is you have the Klan who swoop in to save this damsel in distress from this savage, right? And so that's what is being taught still as a way to say, look how far we've come along in film. When really, when we think about it, we haven't come that far along, because when we start thinking about like who gets cast and why they get cast and the type casting that goes from there, we still see some of these same prevalent notions here. Next slide, please. So Margaret Hunter talks about the maintenance of white supremacy. The aesthetic, ideologic, and material is predicated on the notion that dark skin, right, represents savagery, irrationality, ugliness, and inferiority. White skin, and thus whiteness itself, is defined by the opposite. So civility, rationality, beauty, superiority. These contrasting definitions are the foundation for colorism. So you can't get away from that. Now, me, who presents as a light-skinned Black woman with green eyes and all this education, I have to really be careful, because even when I'm in board meetings, are you making me the preferred Black? Will you hear from me what you will not hear for someone who is a little bit dark-skinned, a little more in terms of melanated, right? Will you hear from me more so than you would someone else who just has a master's degree or who has no degree at all, right? Because if we are not wrestling with these things, then we are indeed perpetuating them. And so one of the examples that I absolutely love to kind of demonstrate this is, next slide, please. This movie that came out is called The Imitation of Life. In both castings of this movie, the only one who is casted, the only lead character who is casted as a fully Black woman is the professed maid. So if you have not seen these movies, please do yourself a favor and see them. The first one was done in 1934. The second one was done in 1959. But in both instances, the mixed race daughter, so she was Black and white, and nobody ever stopped to question, how did this woman get a mixed race daughter? Right? Nobody stops to question that. No one asked if she was the victim of sexual violence. But in both instances, this mixed race daughter is played by a white girl actress. And then her older counterpart is also played by a white woman as well. In the 1959 version with Lana Turner and John Gavin, I believe it is Natalie Wood who plays the daughter when the daughter gets older. Why that is kind of problematic is what it's suggesting, right? They would not cast an actual mixed race actress because they needed the audience to feel sympathy for this daughter. So I won't give away the movie itself, but just sit here and think about, like, what does that mean that you cast someone who is not mixed race because you need the audience. And what we do know is that this plays into stereotypes. The one in particular is the tragic mulatto, who fits nowhere, right? Is not quite Black, but is not quite white either. But we feel sorry for her because their entire lives, they are working to fit somewhere and nobody wants them. purportedly, right? So that leads into what Taylor Hargrove talks about. And next slide, please. Taylor Hargrove is a sociologist and does work around stratification. And she talks about, they talk about, I don't know their pronouns, those of lighter skin are awarded social and economic privileges, right? And so we heard Dr. Roaf say this earlier, because of their closer phenotypic resemblance to whites and their assumption of superior social values relative to their darker skin counterparts, right? So you may not be, or I may not be all the way white, but I'm close enough that I'm comfortable with your form of Blackness. And when we think about Hollywood, even if the story is one of the examples that comes to mind is this idea of Storm in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. X-Men is Marvel. Yes, I think the X-Men is Marvel. Forgive me, y'all. For my kids who are watching, please forgive me. I don't want to hear it later on. Well, Storm, the character, is actually from Kenya, right? Kenya, the country in Africa, but who plays her often are light-skinned biracial actresses. Halle Berry was the first one to play her on the big screen, right? And it wasn't because there weren't Black actresses or deeply melanated actresses at the time who could have done this. It was like, what is going to sell? And so this really speaks to like kind of the economic privileges of when you are going for auditions, who's going to land that role. And we should also step back here and say this. It's not when they get to the camera or to the movie set. These decisions are made in casting when people are auditioning, the authenticity, and you have people who are not even, I know Kev on Stage talked about how he pitched a show, Kev on Stage, who is Black, a Black content maker who opened up Kev on Stage Studios because of this reason, talks about having pitched a show to executives who said, oh, we don't think Black people will get it. And the executives weren't Black. So you are telling a Black person, Black people won't get it, right? We can't make this because we just don't think Black people will get it. Now, for those of y'all who are out there and you're like, wait a minute, but in the 90s, it was like a resurgence of Black television. What happened to all of these Black families? And I would submit to you that there were issues with colorism then as well. I remember My Wife and Kids, where Claire, who is a beautiful chocolate girl, gets changed to this mixed race, curly haired girl, like second season, or it may have even been mid first season, right? So it was there. We even see it now, and we've seen shows tackle it even now. Kenya Barris on Blackish did they kind of covered this a little bit with Diane, and Diane wondering why she was darker than the rest of her family, right? So we know that it still exists, and we know that there's economic privileges because of it. Next slide, please. But just so we can bring it down and bring it home to you so that we can see what this looks like today, every single Black girl and Black woman, at this point, all of these babies are grown, have kind of, I guess, faced the backlash of having been a Black girl who had the audacity to be able to act in scripts that were kind of written from them. So if we start at my left, probably your right, Amandla Stenberg, who played Rue in the Hunger Games, the backlash from Amandla, who was 12 at the time, even one Twitter person noted, well, now that I know that Rue is Black, and mind you, Rue was always Black in the novels, and not just Black, she was dark-skinned Black, right? So the Twitter user says, because I know that Rue is Black, it makes her death less sadder, right? And so when we think about colorism, and even in this case, the reason why we start with Amandla Stenberg is because this is still an instance of Hollywood not honoring the script. The actress should have been a dark-skinned Black girl when we think about this. And then so Amandla is put in the place, and indeed causes backlash. But what would have happened if Amandla had more melanin? I can tell you in the case of Quvenzhané Wallis, who was scripted to play Annie in the remake of Annie, she was called a most reprehensible name, called starts with a C, ends with the UNT. I'll let you go ahead and read that for yourself. The thing is that Quvenzhané was 9 at the time. She was 9 years old. Now, I say the middle two pieces because they are folkloric. So Anna Diop plays Starfire, who is this alien being who has orange skin, y'all. Orange skin and red hair. It's orange. Her skin is orange. She is not from Earth. But the backlash of this Black woman playing, and Anna Diop was called a dark N-word B. Like this idea that Black people don't exist in the future, that they can't play aliens. And in the case of Halle Bailey, they also cannot play mermaids. And the crazy thing about the Halle Bailey case was then we started using science. Well, there is no darkness because mermaids live in the sea. And then would she actually have melanin? Like the craziness to basically move away from using darker hued people, right? And so really, we're not even talking about blatant racism. I think it's more than just racism. It's more than just sexism. It's more than just colorism. We are talking about this prevalent theme of white supremacy and white Eurocentric beauty standards, and that narrative changing, especially now as our country starts to really tend towards the rest of the world, where we're looking at the majority of our country being historically other communities and historically excluded communities or racialized communities as we move forward. Next slide, please. So for those of y'all who are like, and Dr. Roaf, please jump in here. For those of y'all who are like, yeah, but what about Issa Rae or Michaela Cole or Cash Money? I hope I'm saying her name right. Or Cash Baby. No, Cash Doll is her name. Cash Doll or Rashida. Okay, y'all listen. Colorism has loopholes, or what I call like racist things that we'll tolerate because it'll eventually make us money in a capitalistic system, right? And so those really end up being, if a melanated woman, and there's a reason why we're talking about melanated women, if a melanated woman is hyper feminine, if she's hypersexual, hyper productive, hyper talented, or hyper intelligent, then we will allow them to slip through the cracks, right? Because eventually this will please some aesthetic, and it will also allow us to make money in some way. Now, Dr. Roaf and I were talking, and when it comes to Black men, this is actually the inverse, right? So dark melanated men actually fit the trope of whatever this imagined other is in Hollywood. So they typically are hyper masculine, right? Instead of being hyper productive, they may be lazy or in need of, or you see the potential in someone. The movie that I was thinking about for this would be The Blind Side, the Michael Oher story. And typically there's this like saviorism or saviorist underlying tones, or they're not hyper talented or hyper intelligent, but they are hyper driven to do things. So I must be in the league. I gotta get in the league, right? And in terms of hypersexuality, that could never be. So they're typically hyper violent or willing to like tear things down. I will get my way by shooting, right? So there are loopholes in this, but these loopholes really aren't loopholes. They're like playing into this imagined other, what we imagine other people to be, or imagine what, melanated folks to be. Now, when it comes to men, next slide, please. For Black men, this is the inverse, because we know it's light-skinned men who really aren't seen as as productive, as Hollywood famous, if you will. But we wanted to remind you this. The tactic of white supremacy is division, right? So if you're sitting here and you're listening to this and you're like, but I'm light skinned, I got here by my own merits. Pause. That's the wrong way that we should be thinking about this. The tactic of white supremacy is division. And so white supremacy as a power structure, because as we remain divided, we fail to see the intersections of our experience, how even though I grew up in the Southwest and you may have grown up in London, how those experiences really do intersect and they might even be similar. And then even also how we may even have similarities in oppression, even if it's not the same oppression, right? So this is really, really important when we think about this. But then even as we go on to our next question, next slide, please, which is, well, how does colorism show up? What about gender and other races? And so we have a little exercise that you can do at home by yourself or with loved ones, and then really start this conversation. So when we think about men other than Black men, if you Google The Last Airbender by M. Night Shyamalan movie, like, so everything in that quote, I want you to ask yourself, who is featured in that movie? Who is the movie about? And who was casted, right? What do the actors say after we're looking at 11 years from the original release of this movie? What do those actors say, right? If we're thinking about men, Black men, really Google Black male American actor. And what do you notice? Which of your favorite Black male actors are missing? Which ones come up that are not American at all? John Boyega, anyone? And how long do you have to scroll in that Google search before you get to T.I. or Michael Ealy or Terrence Howard, right? When I was doing this search, and I did it several times, this beautiful Black man kept showing up here that is mentioned, that is shown on the screen, right? Next to Idris Elba, John Boyega, who are not American actors at all. But what you'll start to see is the color of these Black men tends toward the more melanated versus the light-skinned, light-eyed actor is very far down if they come up at all. And then finally, for melanated women who just happen not to be Black, one of our favorite exercises is to Google American Indian actress. And how far do you have to scroll before you get to the incomparable and absolutely brilliant Mindy Kaling, right? What's really interesting about when we look at this from an intersectional lens, right? So our experiences as Black women in this call or in this episode, we are Black women. But what is very interesting is you understand that colorism happens for all of these communities, maybe not in the same way, but it's still there, which suggests to us that it's not just a race thing. It has to be something more than race. So I'll put it this way. I'll actually let an author tell you what her experiences were. So next slide, please. So here's the background story. Cassandra Clare is the author of the Mortal Instruments series, and one of her characters is indeed Chinese, speaks Mandarin, is from Shanghai in her story. And so she says the general assumption that is always made about characters is that they are white. And so she's talking about just before she sold the rights to the Mortal Instruments series. And so she says, I am constantly asked if Jim is Chinese, even though he is from Shanghai and speaks Mandarin and says he is Chinese and is portrayed on the cover of the book by a half Chinese model. Apparently, the idea he might not be white is just startling. And why is it startling? Because of things like whitewashing. Because if mainstream media can take an opportunity to accord more privilege and make somebody white, by and large, they will. And every time that it happens, it contributes to the problem and makes sure the problem lasts a little longer, right? So we are not simply just talking about race. We are talking about a pervasive standard, right? Which is why we didn't start with lights against the darks. that's not even where our brain should be. It really needs to be is, what is this underlying thing that constantly has us thinking, oh, well, it's not that bad, right? It's not it That's not really what it is, right? It is exactly what it is. And that is what it is white supremacy. So, Dr. Roaf.
No, you see, I'm just really sitting back and enjoying this. I mean, I was listening to a really interesting song that I hadn't heard before, and it's all the old school kind of West Coast, West Side. That's what we call California in the U.S. rappers like Ice Cube and Too Short, very colorist. But and one of them was bragging about being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And this is really about being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think it's, and the key point that colorism was externally constructed, it is still, as much as there are all these internal dynamics, and it's also externally imposed all over the globe, because it is a direct kind of divide and conquer, right, way of dividing us further. Even you've already got the race, right, stratification system. And with colorism, you have all of these different degrees within groups that creates a color-based stratification system. And just like white supremacy, it's white people, they don't see it, right? Or because they're not directly impacted about it or by it. Like the white director's telling the Black creator, well, Black people aren't going to get it. Well, you don't know what Black people are going to get because you don't know. So you need to sit back, right, and be quiet and listen. And colorism works the same way. Now, it's people who aren't, when you're in a position, what I say, what I have observed in my family is that privilege, it just is the ultimate blinders. Think about a horse and think about leading a horse, and you have these blinders so it doesn't get distracted and it doesn't spook, it doesn't scare. And to me, that's what every form of privilege, and I've seen it up close and personal. Because in my family, the one thing that I could study the range, because I have the range in my family of skin tone, hair texture, eye color, features, body type, height, everything. So, right, this is something that we can get a little bit more of a grasp on, I think. But again, someone who is benefiting from colorism or texturism or featureism or what's called straight bodies, right? Or eye color, and especially if they're benefiting from intersections of those. I've definitely benefited from colorism, from having freckles. And in a way, it offsets the featureism because my features in my family, in my immediate family, are a lot Blacker than that of my sister or of my one brother, and similar to my other brother who was adopted, right? So I've been able to observe and live and experience all of these kind of nuances and kind of all of the different ways that this plays out. And it is complex, but like I've been observing this since I was a child, and really in systematic ways and also in intimate ways. And so, it's interesting because it's very dynamic in that way. And at the same time, it can be very subtle. And like what Dr. Allen is saying, it's very pervasive and it's insidious. And it's not as black and white as like over white supremacist anti-Blackness, pun intended. So it calls upon us to see all of the different shades, right, in between black and white, all the shades of gray, pun intended. And it's just we don't have time. We don't have time for denial. We don't have time for fragility, right? Whether we call it white fragility, any kind of fragility stemming from privilege. We don't have time. We've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so I just and here's another thing that I learned how to say and think. I'm so glad when I don't know, I don't know what I don't know. And that's okay.
Yes.
Because, right, it's not incumbent upon any one of us to have all of the answers. So yeah, that's what came to me, Dr. Allen.
You know what I was
enjoying myself.
You know what I was thinking of?
Yes.
So every year Hallmark comes out with the countdown to Christmas, and they have gotten better over the years, but it feels like other people have written in. I've been one of the people who are like, listen, I am tired of seeing this narrative from this story from these people. Like, y'all use so many people who look alike. I can't tell who is who. And this is to your point about Meghan Markle, who used to be on Hallmark, who would like really do this racially ambiguous thing, right? Now, just recently this year, we have biracial couples on Hallmark. But my issue is you have a Loretta Devine and Loretta Devine's daughters, and I'm like, why do y'all have to go so far left? It is like none of y'all have Black family, or none of y'all have Indian families, or you don't know any and by India I mean India,
Right.
Nobody has Native American families. And so the nuance or the colors that are encompassed in all of these beautiful communities, like Hallmark cannot get it right at all. Or if I'm watching it, I'm like, that is a mother of, it looks like Mexican descendancy, and both of her daughters are blonde hair, blue eyed, and they look very European. And that is not to say that Mexico does not have
right
European features, but it becomes one of those things where it's so glaringly obvious that you were like, does your kid know how to act? Do they want to act? Perfect. Roll cast. Right. So if you watch Hallmark, I think for me is a glaring example of like, wow, none of y'all know Black families at all. Nobody. Okay, that's fine, I guess. That's what I was thinking of. Like,
I'm telling you, it's just everywhere.
Y'all have gotten better, but please, who is in the casting? And then to that point, right? Like, these decisions are made with directors, they're made with casting folks. I'm not in the entertainment business at all. That is not my ministry. But I think it, like, if we're talking about, we want to be better about this, about telling the stories and representing stories to the fullest. One of the things I think we have to do is we have to interrogate our own bias. What is it that we don't know while we're making these decisions?
Right.
Because when it plays out, this is how you get an M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender, which casted predominantly white people in a person of color story.
Yes.
I don't even know, Dr. Roaf. I just don't even know.
I mean, you know, we were having a conversation about what's really interesting and exciting to me is to see, as much as I know social media is very problematic, but it also has a very democratizing impact when it comes to representation. And so I follow a number of Black, dark-skinned Black women, queer, bright Black content creators on YouTube that represent the range of usually millennials and Gen Zs and some pretty old, but like who have been able to accumulate these really significant followings and platforms. And I've not been following mainstream media news for many years because, right, it's owned by a handful of conglomerates, and I would prefer to get just the what, when, who, where, and then do my own research. But it is really exciting to see in some of these spaces where all kinds of content creators, and specifically Black women, especially on platforms like YouTube and Instagram, and dark-skinned Black women who could never access these opportunities any other place are really doing it on social media. And it's really exciting work, and it's really engaging work, and it's really impactful work, as much as a lot of it can be that a valid criticism, in a sense, largely performative, and it really has an impact. And so I will say that and like one channel that's devoted specifically to improving and increasing the representation of dark-skinned Black women with type 4C hair, like upright, with quote unquote what is considered to be the kind of quintessential Black features, again, which are really primarily confined to West Africa. And so I spend all of my time, the vast majority of my time, on those platforms, and it's amazing. It's like breathing in, fresh air after being sequestered in underground in a coal mine for years.
And this is the story of your Insecure. It's the story of Red Table Talk.
Insecure Black Girl was a series on YouTube, y'all. If you have not seen Issa Rae's Insecure Black Girl, I love it. I like it. I prefer it to Insecure. I'm not the intended audience. I'm not.
Neither am I.
I'm not an auntie. I'm a great auntie on my way to becoming an elder. And I was not rocking with Insecure. I get the HBO, but I love Insecure Black Girl because I related to that. It was something universal and about being a blurred, because that's what, right? A Black nerd. But like, I was like rocking with Issa Rae before, and I'm very happy for her. But Insecure is my jam.
Yes.
So Insecure Black, awkward
Black girl. Yes. So when you were saying that, what it made me think of is like the necessity of seeing the wide range of the global majority. I work at a PWI, and I know in my department, when I first got to my department, I was the only, and it felt like such a lonely place. And so I tell this story all the time that I actually went and bought a Hulu subscription so that I could play Living Single in the background, so that it would feel like there were other, you know what I mean? Like there were other Black people who understood me and who got me. And so it was almost like having, like, you have to create these spaces almost. And so I think to your point, Instagram, when we are seeing, like, I was so proud of Black content creators going on strike on specifically
on
Black
TikTok.
Women. On TikTok, this is entertainment, right? And then we know that some of these entertainment or some of these individuals on Instagram, like Just Hilarious, Carlos Miller, Chico Bean, we know that they have moved from Instagram into mainstream. And then when it doesn't work for them, then they create their own platforms. And this is how you get a Kev on Stage. This is how, and y'all go buy his app. This is how you get Tyler Perry Studios. Because the other question I was going to ask you is, are we still waiting for Hollywood to get it? Or do we move on while they're learning and develop our own stuff, regardless of who our is?
I mean, I'm going to bring this back to our house, which is the academy, otherwise known as the plantation of higher education, because it is a plantation. And so I think of it, again, as both and. I think of it as walking and chewing gum at the same time. I think that we are desperately needed in spaces wherever the students are, right? Wherever the Black students, the critical students of color, the critical white students who really, really are about it, like really about decolonizing, right? And removing the shackles. That's the worst shackles are the ones, the ones in a gilded cage. And so I think that it's important for us to be in all of these different spaces. Like, I think about all of the people that I was able to going to a PWI, going to a predominantly white university or institution. And to me, we don't need to just call, and I saw this, and I think, well, this is some questions. I'm co-facilitating a book discussion on racism without races. Why is it that we call historically Black colleges and universities, and we designate that, without calling the vast majority of universities, which is historically white universities and colleges, which are still plantations, right? Why is so? I think that, and unfortunately, HBCUs are not immune from these challenges. And, for Black, we've got to have people, because unfortunately, just having someone with the with the skin doesn't mean that they're our kinfolk. Okay, like
Oh,
Zora Neale
so
said.
right.
Zora Neale
So
said
right.
Zora Neale was given, like, back in Harlem Renaissance, she was letting them have it, and they didn't like her because she didn't care. Like, she did not care. She's like, I'm gonna just call out whatever I see to call out. And so we look at what's happening at Howard right now University, which is where I was born. It's where my father attended dental school. It's just huge in my, like, literal lineage. So, but I think that, and so wherever we are, understanding that whoever this is, like you said, it's even bigger than white supremacy. It's about really radically changing and transforming the status quo of what's it's been a universal struggle across human society, across time, which is whatever system is in place that confers this kind of privilege at the direct expense of the vast majority of us, to the point where we are about to self-annihilate ourselves right off of the planet because we just have people that are so clinging to these old, outdated, and um just they're evil in the sense that, to me, evil is live spelled backwards. So anything that is not of the life force, anything which, right, is not of the creative force, anything that is not from the source, in choice, in thought, in action, in deed, in however seemingly small, is a death, right? It's a death kind of force. It's right, and that's evil, right? It's literally live, right? Spelled back. That's how I make sense of it. But what I would say is, to get back to your question, is we need to be in all of these spaces, right? We need to infiltrate all of these spaces and figure out, like, for me to be on a predominantly student of color campus in a predominantly student of color system that has very few Black students, that is very anti-Black. I've kind of been trained for this ever since. I mean, I was trained as an ESL bilingual elementary school teacher in 1993. I have always worked primarily and overwhelmingly with Latinx, diasporic, Black, right, communities, or African communities, including with Black American. Always, always. I know how to do this work. I know how to build those bridges. And so part of it was, like, accepting that this is where I've been placed also, and that I absolutely love my students. Like, I love my students. And so thinking about what is it, and I don't know that I would, you know, if you look into the history of HBCUs, and they were funded by a lot of powerful, wealthy white men who wanted a place to send their half Black, half white children. And so there's a lot of issues with respectability politics, and there's issues with not having as much of the range in many cases. So it's like, just thinking through, what does it look like, because the students are here. There are, as you heard so vividly, like, more like before when we were talking on the phone, and as it was the case with the discussion that you had with another Black woman where you are in Arizona, we're needed in all of, like, wherever our people are, is where we're needed. And it's kind of like doing both, and it's like, we can't wait on Hollywood, right? We've got to, and I think about a Ryan Coogler, I think about a Black Panther, right? It's like, we're like, I think about an Issa Rae who started out on YouTube. And then, right, and then it's like, oh, come over here. Like, we're building the house, and there is some poaching, but in a way, if we're really strategic, if we're really conscious, if we're really clear, and we're really intentional, it's really hard not to be co-opted, right? It's really, really hard not to drink the Kool-Aid. But I think as long as and I don't think that that's what Issa Rae has done, but I think it's like, especially with our folks, with, any community that's been so just oppressed and beaten down for so many centuries, um right, whether we're talking about Native American and diasporic, or, like, any community, we've developed such a resilience, and we've developed such an ability to be truth tellers and seers, and to take no prisoners, and like, all of these, all of um these attributes of being spiritual warriors. And so a lot of it is, I don't know. Like part of it is I recognize that I don't know ultimately. I know that it's going to take deep healing on every level, that it can't just be with the same minds that got us into this mess. And I just and there are even content creators on YouTube who I really like, who are constantly getting offers as well. And they're like, no, I don't want to do it because I'm going to be filtered. They're like, I'm really good right over here. They want to maintain that creative control over their own vision. And so again, I think it does take the range. And for me, when I think about the plantation that is, everything's a plantation. I really, so the plantation that is higher education, I am so glad that I am here for these students. I shudder to think what would happen, if I weren't here.
That's so like that to me is so interesting, right? Because it prevents also that thing where it's like, I have the best answer, we should all just pack up and leave, or you have the best answer, let's all go do this. But this idea of both and is kind of cool, because I don't have cable television. I don't really do that. I haven't gone to a movie theater in like 2 years, but I shudder to think what a world would be without Terrell Grice and the Terrell Show, or Issa Rae, or Kev on Stage, or even like Angel Lakita Moore Tanksley. I shudder to think what the world would look like if we were just waiting for someone to come and like get it. So I do like that concept. Like, no, we need to do both. We need to do both. And we also need to like not draw a line, right? So if Issa is doing her thing at HBO, continue, go forward. We send you positive vibes. But then there's also like content creators who are not doing things at HBO, or not doing things, or who are doing things with Netflix, right? And so we need you all in those spaces and places. But then we also need the person who is like dreaming things up in their home, and who will put that content out as well, because TikTok during this pandemic has probably saved a lot of lives. Like, what would the world be like without a Tabitha Brown, who is in the entertainment industry, right? So yeah, I 100% agree. All right, Dr. Roaf, final thoughts. What do you think?
Wow, I'm so full. Like, final thoughts. I just
Or questions. I don't know if
I was thinking of a question. I just how do you do it? Like, how do you keeping on?
Myself?
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, I ground myself. Like when we talk about like entertainment and Hollywood, and how even this conversation, I was like, I don't want to come at it from the perspective that we are just so tired of being sick and tired. I find little tips and tricks, right? So I play Living Single when I'm in my office in the background, as a way to be like, Sinclair, you're an idiot. Like, so you actually have to watch the show to understand what that means. I ground myself with like, I call you. I'm like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this concept or this construct, right? Because if we allow ourselves, I also dig into like our ancestors and elder statesmen. So Maya Angelou has a lot of great stuff, and so does Toni Morrison. And so Toni Morrison has always taught me that I have language. If it's not out there, yeah, here's the crazy thing. Like, back when Toni Morrison was an editor, Toni Morrison introduces us to who we call the prolific thinkers of our time. So Angela Davis, I think Toni Kincaid, I'm gonna get her name wrong. Like, but there's a lot of them that she introduces us to. She even says to Angela Davis was like 26 or 30 at the time. She's like, let's do an autobiography. And Angela Davis was like, of what? Like, I've only been on the planet this long, right? But it's this person who is like, look, stop expecting these folks to kind of get you, and talk about your own life experiences. You brought up Zora Neale Hurston,
Oh,
who
God. Yeah.
who back in, the Harlem Renaissance, people hated her. And by
Yeah, they
people,
did. They
I
hated her.
mean Black men. They were like, how dare you write this folklore? This is the type of writing that should be done. And she was like, absolutely not. How dare I rob anybody of the experience and the luxury of just being with me? I love all of me. And it's her who said, I love myself when I'm mad, when I'm upset, when I'm happy. And so I think by grounding ourselves in that work, because it's easy to also get lost in the struggle of
Yeah.
we're not represented. I
Mhm.
think also things like Tyler Perry creating his own studios, right? Or even, and it doesn't even have to be extreme like Tyler Perry. It can
Mhm.
also be the young creative who is purchasing like a mic to do their own
Yes.
podcast, or their iPhone 12 to like shoot shorts. This, like when I look at the whole of TikTok, when I look at Instagram, as you were saying, when I look at Facebook and I see some of the creative things, this is the stuff that keeps me
Yes.
going. Like, even
Yes.
though we're in institutions that may not privilege our knowledge or privilege the way we make that knowledge or epistemologies, right? For those of y'all in academia, what gives me hope is that I'm grounded by, no, I have tools that I can make things with, right? And so
Yes.
even if my scholarship only becomes Black famous, it still lives somewhere, even if it's not recognized, right? Which might be the
Yes.
question is, do I have to be recognized by an academy or by a journal magazine, or does my name have to be in lights for me to contribute something that is amazing, right? For me, live Black experience, this is going to live on.
Yeah,
And
this is the
people are
pinnacle
going,
for me.
you know what I mean? People
Yeah.
are going to be like, oh, Dr. Allen is on tonight, like she be spitting hot fire. It's contrary
Yes.
sometimes, right? And so I think that's the brilliance of it, and getting to work with so many brilliant minds in ways that if we just waited for Hollywood, or if we just waited for an organization to get it, we would never have these opportunities right now. So even though the first one I did, I was so nervous, like, God, I got to study for days and do all this stuff. But it also reminds me, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready.
Exactly. We stay ready
all the
I
time.
mean, we're all, and I think what you're sharing, Dr. Allen, it makes me think of Erica, but I love Mama's Gun. And oh my God, just soul, just medicine. That music is soul medicine. And when she has that song of, no, they won't be naming no big buildings after me that are just going to crumble right in time. And I just, I mean, for me, it's the way that I keep going is really taking to heart, and, having quite a few ancestors in my family now, including my parents and both sets of grandparents. I think about, for me, the golden star is, or the North Star is, what kind of elder am I becoming and do I want to become? And what kind of ancestor do I want to become? That is so, so, so real and palpable for me. And I consider myself a ratchetemic. Y'all can look it up on TED Talk. I'm not a Black academic. I am a ratchetemic all the way.
Come on,
All
Chris.
the way.
Yes.
All the way. Hello,
Please get
Brittany
his book.
Cooper. Hello, the
Yes.
chicken heads come home to roost. Hello, right? Hip hop. I mean, hip hop feminism. Like, it's a right. And I respect, right, Deborah Great White and Patricia Hill Collins and all of and I am an unapologetic ratchetemic. It's a way to challenge the Europeanization in all of these spaces, because what we're talking about is, how do we decolonize and how do we extricate ourselves from this quicksand of Europeanization. So I had this conversation with a student who's majoring in philosophy. I get it. I was like, but what philosophy? Are you talking about Western philosophy? You know about Greece? You know where Greece got you know where they got that? You know where they got that from, the continent and not just Egypt. Decolonized philosophy. They didn't invent that. Europe, we got civilizations that are thousands of years old that make Europe look like a little baby. And the United States is barely an embryo in the womb of the world of civilization. So talk to me and I'm not saying don't read the Western canon. I'm saying expand beyond that. I'm saying do the full genealogy and trace the roots, because they stole everything. We wouldn't have Western civilization as we know it if it hadn't been for the Crusades that lasted for nearly a millennium. The whole Western world as we know it was stolen from the Muslim empire. Period. Hard stop. That's where we get Western civilization from. Don't even get me started. That's why
I'm over here trying not to like break up and laugh, because
this is why I'm a ratchetemic. I'm not everything that you put about white womanhood and civility, and they don't even act like that. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not nothing for the white gays. I know how to code switch. Thank you very much. But that's not what we're talking about right now.
Wow. That's really all I've got to start with is just, wow, this has been powerful conversation. Thank you both for your presentation, the questions that you've been going through now. And I want to dive into a couple questions, and we're going to start with an interesting comment from the comments. Dr. Allen, at one point you were speaking about the exceptions to colorism, and there was a comment that was made that that applies to white women as well. We asked for a follow-up and clarification on that, and the speaker said, white women have faced racism and prejudice simply because we were female when entering what was perceived as a white male industry. Indeed, we are hyper whatever, as Dr. Allen suggested, because we have had the audacity to break into their good old boys club. So comments or thoughts on that?
So this is the part where I want us to be real careful about, us too. This is not about oppression Olympics at all. Indeed, white women have had their own struggles, but what we are saying is that melanated peoples, right, experience a different type of oppression. We're all oppressed, but it's a different type of oppression, especially when we consider like the whole of Hollywood and this entertainment industry is focused on this idealized, centered image or person or persons that doesn't often include melanated peoples. Dr. Roaf talked a little bit about how early in our history, how we weren't even considered human. So then why do you have the audacity to like want to entertain us outside of like this imagined other? Like, this is what we imagine you to be. So I want to be very careful and state that it's really important for us to, like we said, the goal of white supremacy is division. So when we start saying things like, but what about white women? What about Black men? What about gay Black women? What about trans women? We are not denying that at all. I am definitely not denying that. But what I am saying is that it is evident when we look at, Dr. Roaf, what is it called? Disney.
Yes.
Pixar Studios, I think in particular, have this algorithm. And so they actually go through and they count how many times male characters talk, how many times indigenous characters talk. Are indigenous characters to this story included, right? What I'm saying is that there is we can actually go off and say, wow, they cast, what is her name? They casted her as Nina Simone, Zoe Saldana.
Oh, Zoe Saldana.
As Nina Simone, and they altered the way that she looked instead of just casting a Black, dark-skinned actress. That's what we're saying. Indeed, white women have been oppressed. I don't know that I agree that you've experienced racism.
No,
but
they
indeed,
haven't. No.
Indeed, white women have been suppressed, oppressed. And at some points depressed, right? Because we know we were medicating them at one point in our history with like drugs that nobody should be taking. But I'm not here to like draw divisive lines and to say that oh, but what about us? I never denied that. But what I am saying is that we can actually mark with evidence that melanated people have been discriminated against in the Hollywood industry, movie industry.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on what you're saying, Dr. Allen. So 2 points quickly, and I want to get around clarity of language because clarity of language is really critical. So white women do not experience racism, right? They are subject to white privilege. They experience sexism. They experience gender-based violence, gender-based oppression. And then we also have to look at this within an intersectional framework and also understand that white supremacy and colonization is never just solely about race. The kind of formal expression is white supremacist, heteronormative patriarchy. So we're talking about intersections of gender, presumably cis. We're talking about the intersection of socioeconomic status and also of sexual orientation, presumably heterosexual, as well as race. Now, statistically, we've known for a long time that the only group that is second to white men in the US is white women. So when we look at this whole notion of the feminist rallying cry of the 70s of the equal, the EPA, it's for equal pay. And when we break it down intersectionally, the folks who earn the highest amounts across the board in the US, first white men, then white women, then we can go down the list to everybody else. When we look at affirmative action, which there's so many lies of omission and commission, the number one beneficiaries of affirmative action numerically have across every industry, across the board, in every sector, has been and continues to be white women. So we've got to understand that dynamic between intersections of race and gender, et cetera, right, dot, dot, dot. And so the more appropriate, so while there has been, we know, tremendous marginalization and tremendous oppression of white women, when it comes to race and white supremacy, even controlling them for socioeconomic status, racism is far and above, right, um, it has a far greater impact. And even historically, during antebellum chattel slavery in the United States, the laws were reconfigured in a way where white women owned more slaves than anybody else, including white men. So I just think we just need clarification and we need accuracy, right? In the conversation.
Thank you both. This conversation feels very timely. As we said at the beginning, it's always timely. It's always been timely. It is now. It always probably will be. But particularly with, I believe today was the release of the film The Harder They Fall, which is a Black Western. And it was very interesting to see that in the midst of the celebration of this film, there was also the controversy of the casting of Zazie Beetz as the historically dark-skinned Mary Fields, and the conversations about colorism that raised. We saw the same sorts of controversies a couple years ago with the casting of a Black woman as Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter screenplay or stage play. And we're seeing it again in the upcoming cinematic rendition of Nell Larson's Passing. Very interesting conversation there with the casting of what have been called two visibly non-passable Black women as characters who were written as easily passing during that time period. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on passing in particular, with that as an upcoming moment in cinematic history, and the suggesting that this casting choice was really intended to reflect societal constructs of race, and the assumed ability to tell who's Black and who's not based on just appearance.
So one of the things that I want to point out that I came across often when we were doing research for this particular session was Netflix has a tendency to cast um, lighter skinned Black women in a lot of their pieces. So even when we think about My Block, um, Georgia, I think it's like Georgina and something else. It's like these lighter skinned, could pass for biracial individuals. I want to be very, very clear that we are not saying you should not be playing this role. What I am asking us to do, here's an example. King Richard is coming out. Why is Will Smith playing Serena and Venus's father? Right? So what I'm asking us to do is like to also be authentic as well. I understand that people have to eat. I understand that we we're out here we get cast, we're trying to make money. But I think of the young lady when Lifetime wanted to do the Aaliyah movie, and I cannot remember her name, and the family was like, no, don't do that. And she said, out of respect for this family, I'm not going to do that. I feel like if we all do the same thing, was there somebody else who could have played Mary Fields? Have we called Netflix out on like this tendency, or made them aware that you tend to like lighten up Black women who are doing amazing things? Because I think what I don't want to have happen is to have Zazie Beetz take the heat for a decision that she didn't make. But also, I want Zazie Beetz to say, did you think about this person for this? Because if we blame Zazie Beetz, then we will blame John Boyega, will blame Cynthia Erivo for playing Aretha Franklin. And so it'll move from like light skinnedness to nationality. And so that's what I'm asking us to do, is to really be clear on where does this conversation need to lie, but also for us to be like, I know that you casted me for this, but is there somebody else who could better play this role, or who is more authentic to the role? I would have more issues with it if Zazie, if she changed her body to then become Mary Fields, which is what happened with Nina Simone. That's my thought.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. I want to integrate also lived experience. I am ethnic studies, I am Black studies, and these are two fields that are absolutely for us, by us. It's very important that Black scholars, right, we study, we produce our own knowledge, and lived experience is central to that, right? We do not subscribe to these westernized, really false dichotomies of this notion of object versus subject or objectivity, right? None of that. So what I will say, what's interesting about in relation to another film about passing, I have white passing people in my family. I have people in my family who actually who have been passing for a couple of generations that I know of. I have cousins who are Europe, or young adults who are blonde and blue eyed, and I would not know them. We would not know each other if we bumped into each other in the street. So I will say that. So I have a lot of actual experience with what white passing looks like. Here's the other thing I will say about that. When I came to Arizona as a grad student at NAU in 1997, there were literally Black people that I would see, and this, who I knew were Black, who I didn't think were white passing, but they were getting away with it. White people didn't know, because again, this gets back to the imagined other. It gets back to a very limited, constrictive, and very stereotypical one-dimensional notion of what the full range of anything that's not white. And so I knew that, I was like, wow. And I started seeing it more and more. And I said, oh, Black people who want to pass for white come to Arizona. They come up into the mountains. They come to a part of the country which has very few Black people, and increasingly more and more, which then it may not be easier, but instead of critiquing those Black individuals, I looked at the larger context of the place itself, and of the geographic region itself, and of the history itself, and of like coming from the Deep South, coming from the Mississippi Delta, being very, very rooted and grounded in a very, very historically Black part of the country and ground zero descended from enslaved peoples and sharecroppers, of which my father was one. And then going to the East Coast, like it wasn't just within my own lived experience of my family. I have been immersed in Blackness for all of my formative years, for most of my adult life. So I understand the range and the beauty. And I understand that most people who are not accustomed to this and don't understand this, their heads will literally explode. I am telling you that from experience. And so, right, we talk about white passing. I'm like, I actually saw it. It depends on the context, because I saw it when I came to Arizona the first time. I said, these folks are really up in here passing and they fooling these white. But again, it goes back to actually what we're talking about, this constant erasure. But you know that, and going back to this waiting, like we know who we are. We know how bad and beautiful and bodacious and brilliant we are. And we do not need anyone's approval or permission. Hard stop.
Thank you both. One of the really powerful things that you shared during the presentation was, Dr. Allen, when you discussed the placement of whiteness and Eurocentricity over authenticity and comfort before truth. And that to me is just a very powerful statement. I think it's a really powerful place for us to wrap up this evening, is to talk or take us a little further into that idea of the elevation of comfort and the avoidance of truth when it comes to having these conversations. How does this Hollywood standard translate into our general social constructs? Where is it as a broader society essentially holding us back from real progress? And how shall we overcome it?
You know, my part of my lineage is from the South, and they would say the only way to like clean a room is to address the elephant. They would say other things, but I'm giving you like the marked down version of that. And I feel like because we have, this is so much bigger than this conversation, but because we have not even reckoned with the horrific acts that we're still digging up in our backyards, like, and I mean literally bones, mass graves, because we haven't even addressed that. How then can we have an open conversation about it's very hard to say, well, I prefer someone who looks a little bit more whiter. Like it's not appropriate to say those things out loud anymore. And so when we talk about how does this like spill over into our everyday lives, well, I'm sorry for laughing, y'all, but I think of like politics and dog whistle politics. We can no longer say Negro or the other derivative that comes from that, right? That's a really nice one. But what we can say is urban blight, urban development. We can say things like busing. We can say things like Title I schools, right? And so we code these things under a language because it's more comfortable for us to then, instead of accepting the blame, to actually talk about these things that have built our country, talking about white supremacy. One of the quickest ways to get people to squirm in a room and start saying anything black and white, right? Or even, so if we can't even get past the black and white dichotomy of racism and race relations in this country, how do we even begin to talk about the number of Indigenous women and girls that go missing daily that nobody talks about? How do we talk about how justice for the sexual assault and sexual violence committed against missing women, missing Indigenous women and girls, and how our government, our American government, has stripped away the rights of tribal courts to actually deal with these things? How then do we talk about separating kids from their parents at the border and not even treating them as kids, about the traumas that come from that, or the molestations and the sexual violence that have happened in these cages, right? How do we then talk about having a former Black president and a current woman who is now she's biracial, right? Because this is also what happens is we move from being Black to biracial, right? How do we then talk about a president who has an immigrant mother of Indian descent and a Jamaican father, and her telling other immigrants, don't come here? So this is how it spills over, and we think, oh, it's just in Hollywood, it's a Hollywood thing. But the problem with us treating diversity, equity, and inclusion like as an existential or a thing that's over there is that we don't understand that it happens in our everyday lives. Equity is an everyday, daily decision that we make. Do we get up in the morning and do we address our biases? Do we check ourselves when I say things like, why did I lock my door when I saw this particular person? And I think these are the ways that it spills over into our lives that we don't check because we're like, well, this is just the way it is. Or when we are sitting around a table at a day called Thanksgiving and we don't acknowledge the trauma that holiday actually means. Right. And it's coming up. Oh, we'll see. My favorite is when Campbell's then starts Campbell's and other, well, actually, I don't think it's, well, yeah, it is Campbell's and like the onion casserole, the green bean casserole with the onions on it. And you have the visibly or the audibly Black singers in the back singing for this, in you got the like church hermeneutics going on. So that's what we paint over. It's like a branded history versus the reality, right? And so whatever makes us comfortable, that's what we're going to go with. And so anybody like myself, like you, like Live Black Experience, who come to the table, we say these things and we say, no, we're not going to just glance over it. The way we try and silence it then is we say, stop being divisive. We're just here for unity. Right. And so we use these dog whistle politics to then silence Black women or silence whoever the person of color at the table who is saying your food is bland and we need to address it. I think that's how it shows up in our everyday lives. Now, just because I'm a solution-oriented person, this is how we can address it. Every single day, equity happens in the daily decisions. Jamila Dugan says, y'all be wary of these tropes and traps of equity. Be wary of these, and I'm going to extend it, Jamila Dugan, to beware of these tropes and traps of diversity and inclusion and unity, right? Because we're not willing to say, ooh, me challenging the colorism in Hollywood may mean that I have to give up a role. And I have to be okay with that. If we're not willing to say in our education systems, oh, I need to check myself. Why is it that every time this parent calls in to be a part of their child's education, I feel a sort of way? I label them as hostile. If we're not willing to check our biases, right? The stuff that mama and daddy said, well, the reason why we don't trust Chinese people is because they always looking out for their own, right? If we're not willing to do this work in ourselves, forget change in the world. Ooh, just change you. That's it. Don't bring nobody else in to your organizations or anything else. Sit with you first. And I will tell you, this is something that I do every day. Why does this student irk my nerves? Why does this person get on my nerves? Where did that thought come from? Why do I believe this? I mean, these are just examples. I don't necessarily believe these things, but I'm constantly checking myself and interrogating myself because bias is sneaky. It'll make you believe that you got this degree and this is an educated thought when really it's borderline prejudice and a bias that has been passed down because of socialization. That's how I would say, I don't know. That's how I would say.
Dr. Roaf, anything to add or close us out?
I'm going to just add my period dot onto Dr. Allen's statement. And this is universal law. And it's true for us individually and collectively at every level. And it's the key to this really monumental crossroads that we face as an entire species. We cannot change what we will not acknowledge. And that's the choice. That's it. That's all. It really is.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. This was a powerful presentation. It always is when we have both of you on. So I appreciate you joining us tonight. And to close us out, we say thank you to our audience. Thank you for joining us, for listening, and hopefully learning along with us tonight. We want to remind you always, as we're getting close to the end of the year, we are currently streaming these from the Murdoch Center community page. At the beginning of the year, we will be transitioning to the Lived Black Experience Project page. So make sure you're following that page so you can continue to see these sessions live. With that, we wish you a pleasant evening. Be well, be safe, and go in grace.